A lot of great games came out in 2020, and with all the time I had to spend at home, I was able to play through pretty much everything I was interested in. So since I actually know enough to talk about the nominees for Game of the Year this year, I figured I'd do it, because if you know me, you know I love talking about video games. So here are my thoughts on this year's nominees. Oh, it comes with a pen. New Horizons is a great title for the Switch, and Animal Crossing is just one of those games that benefits much more from being on a portable console, you know? I can chop trees down and hit people on the head with a net whenever I want. There are also a bunch of cool new features that weren't around in the older games. I think being able to customize literally the entire island is amazing. They're also still releasing updates and adding more stuff, which is great. To be honest, I was really surprised this got nominated. My original predictions for the nominees were actually spot on except for this game, which was nominated instead of Cyberpunk, but I think we all know why Cyberpunk's not here. Anyways, after some thought, I can definitely see why New Horizons was a pick. I think the game can be enjoyed by pretty much anybody because of how casual it is. This is also the only nominee that almost all of my friends who care about games got into for a while, and considering that New Leaf came out in 2012, I think it's fair for fans of the series to be as hyped for this game as they were. And I think Nintendo really managed to meet their expectations. They pretty much retained everything that was great about the previous games and added more onto it. And that's how you make a good sequel. But having said all that, this is definitely not Game of the Year to me. Like I've been saying, New Horizons has a lot going for it, but it still really pales in comparison to like pretty much everything else on this list.
But hey Einstro, New Horizons is supposed to be a much more relaxing experience compared to everything else, which is why it might seem a lot less exciting when you compare it this way.
You know what? That's a pretty good point. So let me talk more about why I don't think it's Game of the Year. Sure, the game's good and appealing to a large audience, but its core gameplay loop is still very similar to previous entries of the series, and it's not something we haven't seen before in other games either. So what I'm trying to say is, New Horizons isn't particularly groundbreaking or mind-blowing in any way, and after a while the game got kinda stale for me and a lot of other people I know. But compared to the other nominees' intense and rewarding gameplay, their rich open worlds and directing, and I'll talk about this game later, New Horizons didn't really wow me as much, and I think it really struggles to stand out amongst the other nominees. So I'll be pretty surprised if this wins Game of the Year. I don't think it will, but yeah, you know, go get this game for your grandma. She'll probably enjoy it.
That's stupid.
Kathy,
What?
what are you playing?
I'm playing Animal Crossing on Switch. I missed that fish! Shit!
Let me just start by saying that I don't think any other game I've played that came out this year came close to giving me the same level of enjoyment that Doom Eternal did. Now, I've never really been that into single-player campaign shooters. I did play a lot of Halo when I was a kid, and I loved the campaigns of those games, but after I finished Halo 3, I was kind of just done with single-player shooters. My passion shifted mainly towards multiplayer shooters, like Team Fortress 2. During that time, the single-player shooters I got into were mostly stuff like Fallout, Far Cry, GTA, Watch Dogs, but the thing that separates these games from shooters like Halo, or Wolfenstein, or Call of Duty, or Bioshock is that they have an extra open world with side content attached to the campaign, and I feel like I was playing them more for the open world than for the shooting and the combat. I did play some campaign-focused games like Bioshock Infinite and the newer Halo titles, but I didn't really find them as fun. Until I decided to try Doom 2016, which is when I realized, damn, shooting shit on my own is actually pretty fun. For me, Doom 2016 will always be a great example of how you can take an old formula and turn it into something great with a little bit of innovation and creativity. Having enemies drop health from glory kills and encouraging the player to be aggressive and rely on killing enemies to stay alive instead of hiding behind cover all the time seems like such a simple idea, but it's what made the game so fun and stand out from other shooters. But you remember how I was saying that Animal Crossing New Horizons did a good job as a sequel? Well, Doom Eternal is that times like 100. I could probably go on for like an hour about why I love Doom Eternal so much, but I'll try to condense it as much as possible. First of all, the dash was an amazing addition which allowed them to balance enemies around the player being more mobile, which allows the game to have much more intense and fast-paced combat. The addition of tools like the Flame Belch and Blood Punch, as well as demons having weak spots that you can target, adds much more depth to the combat. I've seen people complain about the low ammo capacity, but I think it's a good way to challenge the player to use every weapon instead of just sticking to one, and they also balanced it by having the ammo for the chainsaw regenerate. I'm just really happy to see that Eternal managed to surpass its predecessor in terms of both gameplay and challenge. This is a game that really forces you to learn the counterplay to each enemy and use every tool at your disposal efficiently. Those of you watching who know me probably know that I'm into competitive Smash Brothers, and this is the same reason I find Smash and other fighting games so interesting, because one of the ways you improve is by understanding matchups and how to properly utilize your character's moves. In terms of other single-player games that do this, the only other game that comes to mind is Sekiro, which, oh, would you look at that? I won some kind of award last year. I think it says Gami of Tahiyar. So I think it goes without saying that Doom Eternal is my game of the year, but there are still a few other nominees that I think would deserve the award as well. If you're a fan of shooting games or even remotely like them, please play this game. It's so good. I never actually had a PlayStation when I was a kid, so I only played the original Final Fantasy VII like a year before this game came out. And I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a fan, but as someone who played the original, I was pretty satisfied with what we got out of the remake. I think the reimagination of Midgar portrayed in FF7R is beautiful, and that the story is a lot more engaging and easier to follow now that it's fully voiced and I can actually tell what's going on. In the original, I couldn't really follow what was happening half the time because the characters just kind of vibrate around and say stuff. So it's much clearer now that the game has better visuals. I also want to say before I forget that the remastered soundtrack is banger. Like, let me turn this shit up so you can hear it. They can come and claim the copyright if they want because it's so goddamn good. I'm not going to talk too much about the story. It pretty much follows the same one as the original except for the ending, and there's a lot of mixed opinions about it, but I'm actually leaning more towards the side of liking it. I'm not going to spoil what happens, but the reason why I like it is simply because it sets up the next act very well, and now we actually don't know what to expect even though the game is supposed to be a remake of something that came out in 1997. Because even if they don't change anything at all in the next act and Aerith still dies, I'll still be surprised because the way the first act ends really makes it seem like anything can happen. Also, did you know that Cloud's grab in Smash Bros. Ultimate is actually slower than almost every other character's? This is actually there by design as a reference because he couldn't grab Aerith fast enough to pull her out of the way of getting stabbed by Sephiroth. Anyway, now I'm going to talk about some problems I have with this game, and wouldn't you have guessed, I'm going to talk about the combat now. Now, I think the concept they had was brilliant, with the mix of real-time combat and ATB generating from attacks, and I was super excited to try it out when they first showed it off. But unfortunately, they didn't execute the idea very well. I only really found playing as Cloud and Tifa very fun. Aerith kind of feels like shit to play, and Barrett is good, but he's kind of boring, because you're kind of just walking around and holding square half the time. There are also some enemies that are incredibly annoying to fight, like the stupid frog guys in the sewer. Eligor is also a huge stinking pile of horse shit. And the combat really ends up suffering from the same problems the other non-turn-based Final Fantasy games have, which is that they can't decide whether or not they want the combat to be fully dynamic or not, and you have these weird intervals where you just can't avoid taking damage and the whole system ends up feeling clunky and slow. I'm of the opinion that combat in a video game can choose between two things to prioritize, which is the player's skill and ability to master the combat mechanics, or the player's character's stats and how they strategize with what they have. Usually there'll be a good mix of both these aspects, but you can normally tell which one is more important. The problem I have with combat systems like the one in FF7R is that I don't know if I'm losing because I don't know how to fight properly or because my characters are too weak. and I can't tell if the damage I'm taking is avoidable or not. And this is a problem I have with a lot of other JRPGs too. They just can't seem to decide what kind of system they want to have and end up having this weird half-dynamic combat, and it's usually not very good. At the end of the day, even though I enjoyed playing this game from start to finish, I probably wouldn't vote it for Game of the Year, because I think some of the other titles that were nominated deserve it more. I'm still really glad I played this game and that it exists. I love seeing remakes of really old games using new technology which allow directors to fully realize the visions they had for the original games. Ghost of Tsushima is another amazing exclusive that makes me glad I own a PS4. I'm a big fan of action-adventure open-world games, so it's probably natural that I like this game. Compared to the other smash hit exclusives on the PS4, this game is definitely on the same level. What sets this game apart from others in its genre for me is its art direction as well as its storytelling. If you're a big fan of the whole Bushido, Warriors Code kind of story, there are plenty of moments in this game that you'll definitely love. While the story was good, I don't think it would have been nearly as compelling if not for the amazing directing accompanied by the game's strong and emotional soundtrack. In terms of its open world, I feel like it does everything that's required pretty well. There are a lot of interesting activities and collectibles scattered around as usual, as well as a good number of side quests. There are some missions that you can do to get legendary moves which I really loved. I think the tales of legendary warriors told in those quests were very interesting and that the moves you get from them are super cool. The environment of the game is also extremely beautiful, every area looks great and it really immerses you into the experience. I had a lot of fun with the game's combat, it's sufficiently challenging and I found it enjoyable from start to finish. Not having a lock-on is okay in my opinion, I kind of got used to it after a while and I don't really think the game needs one either. There are also a big bunch of upgrades you can unlock to suit your playstyle which helps to keep the combat fresh. I also really like the use of different stances to deal with different enemy types, although you don't really need to use them if you're using stealth. The only problems I had were that some of the side narratives felt kind of draggy because they spanned over all 3 acts of the game, and that the open world activities will probably be a bit repetitive for some people. Although this game doesn't top Breath of the Wild as my favorite open world game, it's still an outstandingly rich experience filled with emotion and culture. I think Ghost of Tsushima definitely deserves Game of the Year. I wouldn't be too surprised if it won, and I wouldn't really be upset either. It's a solid open world game that conveys a lot of emotion and tells a simple yet compelling story. I'm still waiting for a game that will surpass Breath of the Wild in terms of exploration and discovery, but nevertheless, Ghost of Tsushima definitely left a lasting impression on me.
Dare lash out against me like this, boy.
I do.
What you desire is impossible.
Like you would know.
I do, you idiot.
I've been a fan of Supergiant games since Bastion came out in 2011, and I'm glad to see them still going strong with their newest game, Hades. I've played quite a few roguelikes over the years, but Hades stands out to me as one with a much stronger and more important narrative. After every run, you get to hear a little bit of extra dialogue and occasionally meet new characters, which add on to the extensive lore of the underworld. Even though I've beaten the game multiple times, this is one of the reasons I still find myself wanting to come back and finish a run every now and then. The writing in this game is really entertaining, every character is pretty likable to me, and Zergris is also a very charming main character.
Not everybody knows exactly how to give you pets and live to tell it, right, boy?
As someone who likes the Monogatari series, random character banter is something I love, and there's a ton of it in this game.
I just wanted to apologize because I think maybe I didn't act very appropriately last time you spoke to me. But I just really like this job, and I promise I will always do my very best, so I just hope I'll have another chance.
Deuce, please, there's no need to apologize. You've been doing a wonderful job, really.
What? You really mean it, Prince? Thank you. Thanks so much.
Upgrades for builds come in the form of boons from Olympian gods, with each god offering a certain ability that's consistent throughout their selection. There's also a rarity system for the upgrades, so each time you choose a god, you're basically rolling for the highest rarity, which I appreciate because it helps to sate my crippling gambling addiction. There's naturally a very large number of possible builds, also due to Zergris having a lot of moves that can be upgraded. So you're probably never going to be forced into having the exact same build twice. Every weapon in the game feels unique and great to use, and there will probably be one that suits you. These weapons can also be permanently upgraded along with some of Zagreus' stats. There are also different versions of the weapons which have some kind of gimmick that allows you to use them differently, and this is great for players who like using the moveset of one specific weapon and allows them to change up the way they play. In terms of combat, this game plays quite similarly to Bastion. It's much faster, but it's still pretty accessible in my opinion. Not only does Hades do everything a roguelike game is supposed to do well, it stands out by giving more motivation to keep playing through its story, characters, as well as its sheer amount of content. Having played this game in early access and watched it slowly come to completion, I'm very happy to see that it's being received so well. I definitely think Hades deserves Game of the Year, and I would probably have voted for it if Doom Eternal wasn't nominated. Either way, it's always great to see an indie game nominated for Game of the Year. Also, please vote for this game for Best Indie, cause if Fall Guys beats this game, I will be so sad.
I'll walk
The lonely road, the only one that I have ever known.
So we've finally come to the last game, which is also called The Last of Us Part 2. Before I say anything, I'm going to set one thing straight. I've seen a playthrough of both Part 1 and 2, but I've not actually played the games myself. And it's not for any other reason than that I personally just don't enjoy playing zombie survival games. So I'm going to be giving thoughts as a viewer rather than as a player. Before I start talking about the story, I'm just going to say a few things about the gameplay. Now, I've always viewed Naughty Dog games as more of cinematic experiences than video games, and most people who've played the Uncharted games will probably know what I mean. There's always a good amount of gameplay with shooting or melee combat and stealth, but there's also copious amounts of just doing nothing, like walking around from place to place and climbing, which is why I think that the reason Naughty Dog games are so successful is because of their stories and directing. If we were to just consider gameplay alone, it's decent, it's not bad, but there are a ton of other games that do similar things better. Okay, I will now be giving my opinion about the story of The Last of Us Part 2. Normally I don't like to dive into spoilers when talking about games, but seeing how important the story is as part of this game's experience, it really can't be avoided. I'm going to spoil the events of Part 1 and 2 as well as these other games on the screen, so please skip ahead to this time if you don't want to be spoiled. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is Joel's death. Many people think that the way he died was kind of pathetic for a main character, which I can kind of understand. I feel like in most stories, important characters that are well liked always die in very touching or heroic ways. I get that Joel might not deserve an honorable death because of what he did at the end of Part 1, but at the same time it's not like he hasn't paid the price for it. There's already a rift between him and Ellie because of what he did, and the game expands on this as well through his flashbacks. And even though Joel was kind of a selfish prick in the first game, you can see that he's grown to become a much more caring person in Part 2. Joel, you are a bad guy, but this does not mean you are a bad guy. The problem I have with killing Joel off in such a weak way is that it didn't have much of an emotional impact on me as the deaths of many other notable characters from other games. I personally found it kind of hard to get attached to any of the new characters. All of Abby's friends that Ellie kills are only really fleshed out by the time you already know they're going to die, because you've already killed them as Ellie, so it's like,
I'm fucking dead anyway, why would the player care about me?
There are a few character deaths that are brushed off very quickly considering how important the game seems to regard them. They just kinda get shot and then you never hear about them ever again. There are also a lot of weird scenes that felt forced, and I think you probably know what I'm talking about, so I'm not gonna bother explaining it. Having a dual narrative with Abby and Ellie Having a dual narrative with Ellie and Abby is an interesting idea, but it wasn't executed very well. Part of the reason why I think people ended up not liking Abby is because the game makes you wait too long before it decides to develop and humanize her, which happens hours after you see her showing zero hesitation in killing and torturing a man that saved her life. The first part of Ellie's arc was also very dry for me. Up until the point she finds Nora, it doesn't really feel like anything has happened. I think that having Ellie's part end on a cliffhanger and returning to it as Abby to have a big climactic battle between the two main characters is clever, but it wasn't very powerful for me because of one reason, which is that there's only one outcome. By the time you reach this point, the game has already given you sufficient time to spend with both Ellie and Abby to at least kind of understand and empathize with them, but you don't get to decide who you want to side with. The two main characters obviously have conflicting goals because they want to kill each other, but you're forced to align yourself with Abby's goal to kill Ellie. Now I want to compare this to another game which did something similar, and that game is Nier Automata. This game. So in its second act, there are two stories you can switch between which follow 9S and A2, both of them having the same goal of destroying this big evil machine tower. But here's the catch, 9S saw A2 kill 2B, so he wants to kill her, but what he doesn't know is that 2B was actually infected by a machine virus and entrusted her memories to A2, who she also asked to take care of 9S. Okay, so a bunch of stuff happens. You watch 9S become more and more unstable because of his grief and anger, and you learn that A2 is actually kind of a sweetheart and just wants to protect the innocent. Okay, anyway, a lot of stuff happens, and then there's this boss battle. They fight the Incredibles robot, but when the two characters finally meet, the game hits you with this.
うるさい！君は 2B を殺したじゃないか。それだけで十分だよ。僕たちが殺し合う理由なんて。2B は苦しんでいたよ。君を殺し続けることを本当は気づいていたんだろう。ナインエス。うるさい。うるさい！お前に言ったね。僕たちの何がわかるって言うんだ。
推奨停戦。ここで彼女と争うことは
ポット1号さんに命令。貴様の独断の論理思考と発言を禁止する。この命令は A2 か僕のどちらかの生命活動の停止が確認できるまで維持しろ。
At this point, I'm like, what the hell? Now I have to choose between 9S, who I've known since the start of the game and really want to help because he's in so much pain, or A2, who's a kind soul that's just misunderstood and really wants to help 9S and is also really, really hot? Oh shit! Now compare this to The Last of Us 2.
I know why you killed Joel. He did what he did to save me. There's no cure because of me. I am the one that you want. Just let him go. You killed my friends. We let you both live. And you wasted it. Wait! Get off of her! Move me! Come on.
But yeah, hopefully you can see where I'm coming from. Assuming the game successfully managed to attach me to both the main characters, it would have been so much more powerful to force me to choose between the two instead of deciding for me. The game also tries to make you feel bad for a lot of things you do as Ellie, but the issue is that a lot of terrible things she does in this game are forced. Like, the game literally forces you to do them, or they happen in cutscenes. And I think this whole idea kind of falls apart because it's like, why should I feel bad? The game didn't even give me a choice. I'm not the one who decided to kill that pregnant lady. Lastly, I think that having the ending of Part 2 parallel Part 1s is a nice touch. Ellie and Joel both go through a long and painful journey and end up changing their minds at the very end. But I think the reason why people are a lot less happy with Part 2's ending is because the choice Ellie makes is a lot less thought-provoking than it was for Joel. And considering the sheer number of people Ellie kills just to get to this point, it just seems really odd for her to suddenly decide she doesn't want to kill Abby anymore. So do I think The Last of Us Part 2 deserves Game of the Year? Personally, no, not really. But I can still see a lot of people voting for it. This game was incredibly polarizing, but there's still a good number of people who really liked it. But for me, I'd say I wasn't as impressed by its story as I was for Part 1, and its gameplay doesn't really stand out among the other nominees either. Okay, so if you made it this far into the video, I'd just like to say thank you for watching the whole thing. I'm no professional critic or reviewer, but I put a lot of effort into making this video. If you have any feedback, please feel free to let me know in the comments, and hopefully I was able to offer some kind of insight. Until we see each other again.